Ladies and gentlemen, Devyar Sajjano, a very good afternoon to all of you and welcome to this webinar. My name is Ajay Thomas and I'm the Director of the Faculty of Law at Manav Rachna University. Welcome to this webinar, which is the fourth in a series of very successful back to basic webinars organized by the Faculty of Law, Manav Rachna University, where the focus has been on dealing with fundamental concepts relating to the practice of law. The first in this series was a masterclass on the fundamentals of pleading by Justice Pradeep Nandrajog. The second was on the essentials of examination in chief and cross-examination in a civil trial by Justices Rajiv Sahay N. Law and Pradeep Nandrajog. The third was conducted by Justice Jayant Nath and Senior Advocate Akhil Sibal. And for the fourth in this series, ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted and honored to have with us a sitting judge of the Delhi High Court and a leading senior advocate who will be dealing with the topic of the power of courts to grant interim reliefs in arbitration under Section 9 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. Now, before we proceed to the webinar proper, here's a little more about our distinguished speakers for today. Our first speaker is Justice Jyoti Singh of the Delhi High Court. Justice Singh holds degrees in botany and law from Delhi University. On joining the bar, she specialized in service and administrative law, in particular matters relating to the armed forces and paramilitary forces. She practiced before the Supreme Court, the High Court of Delhi, and various tribunals. She was a member of the Delhi High Court Legal Services Committee and participated in numerous Lok Adalats and workshops organized by the committee. Justice Singh was designated as a senior advocate in 2011 by the Delhi High Court and elevated as a judge of the same court in 2018. Our second speaker for today is Mr. Parag Tripathi, senior advocate. An alumnus of Delhi University and Harvard Law School, Tripathi has been in active practice at the Supreme Court and the High Court since the early 1980s. He was designated as senior advocate in 2000 and appointed as Additional Solicitor General of India in 2008, a position that he served with distinction until 2012. Mr. Tripathi's areas of specialization include constitutional law, administrative law, commercial corporate laws, and of course arbitration. But for most of us in academia, Mr. Tripathi is known as the illustrious son of an illustrious father, Professor P.K. Tripathi, who Professor Upendra Bakshi very often refers to as one of the pioneering modernizers of Indian legal education. And Professor Tripathi was also instrumental in introducing the Socratic method of teaching at Delhi University. Now, from a Manav Rachna Faculty of Law perspective, we have a close association with Mr. Tripathi. Mr. Tripathi is on our board of advisors to the Faculty of Law, and we are indeed delighted and honored to have his support and guidance, in his capacity as advisor to the board of advisors. Now, to moderate this webinar, we're delighted to have with us two young rising stars of the Delhi Bar, Akanksha Kaul, who holds an LLM degree from Columbia University and an LLB from King's College London. She also acquired a coveted BA Honours in History from St. Stephen's, Delhi. She works as an independent counsel and has previously worked for Luthra and Luthra law offices and at the chambers of the Additional Solicitor General of India. Our second moderator is somebody I refer to as Dak Saab. Now, Dak Saab is Dr. Shashwat Bajpai, who is the founding partner of DRSP Law Chambers, and he has had the great advantage of being a third-generation lawyer. Dak Saab holds a bachelor's in commercial law from Oxford, where he specialized in corporate business, taxation, and also arbitration. He also holds a PhD from the National Law University, Delhi, where his thesis was on transfer pricing and international taxation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before I hand over this webinar to our moderators, I would like to thank Bar and Bench for being the media partners for this event. So Akanksha and Sashwat, I hand over this webinar into your safe hands. Over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a ton, Ajay. Thanks a ton for the warm welcome. And I must say a warm welcome to all that have gathered here from their respective virtual rooms. It's a privilege to have been given the opportunity by Ajay to share this virtual dais with the esteemed panel of Justice Singh, who's authored some of the most stellar judgments recently on, especially on Section 9. And of course, Mr. Parag Rao, Tripathi Senior Advocate, having brilliantly argued quite a few of them. Now, just a quick recap, coming to the topic of the day, Section 9 has been one of the most invoked sections on the arbitration statute book, along with Section 11 and 34. Its applicability to foreign-seated arbitrations has been the matter of intense debate for the last 2 decades, as seen as Bhatia and Balko. The insertion of the proviso to subsection 2 of Section 2 to the Mega 2015 amendments has opened up a Pandora box of litigations. A lot of additional interesting aspects have arisen over the course of few months, few years, which we shall strive to cover today in the course of this webinar, pertaining to locus of third parties per Section 9, as also the interplay between emergency arbitrator institutional provisions and Section 9 as it stands. Now we have a lot of ground to cover, so without further ado, I hand it over to Justice Singh, please.
Thank you, Shashwat. Good evening to everybody. And to begin with, a lot of thanks to the coordinators of this webinar to have called me here to be a part of it. Thanks to the moderators as well, and all those who have today joined this session. Section 9 and the powers of the court to grant interim relief and injunctions is what we are talking about today. The subtopics on which I have been called upon to really talk today is the Section 9 and the powers with respect to the bank guarantees, and also the basic principles underlying when the court exercises power under Section 9. Now, first topic that I would like to pick up is about the bank guarantees. A lot of matters, as we all know, are filed under Section 9 seeking restraints against invocation of bank guarantees. Now, a bank guarantee is really a security or a pledge which the bank gives to a third party and takes the responsibility upon itself to pay up the money in case its customer fails to do so. Bank guarantees, as we all know, are of two kinds, conditional and unconditional bank guarantees. Now, conditional bank guarantees don't pose much of a challenge because these are generally invoked when certain conditions of the contract are not fulfilled. And very often or not, the restraint orders are granted. Of course, the court examines and goes into the realm of whether the prerequisites, etc., are complied and met with or not. The larger challenge really that is posed is with respect to the unconditional and irrevocable bank guarantees. Now, this bank guarantee by its very nature is unconditional, irrevocable. And when we look at the way this is drafted, it usually says that when it is invoked, the bank would, at the instance of the beneficiary, honor it without any demo, without any protest, and dehoards the disputes that may arise between the guarantor and the beneficiary. So it is this restraint order which often creates a problem while granting a restraint. Now, as far as these bank guarantees are concerned, the rule is that the courts would usually not entertain any petition seeking a restraint. There are exceptions, which are two. One of them is fraud, and the other is irretrievable and irreparable harm. Now, those are also thresholds which are very, very high, and not simply pleading vague fraud and irretrievable harm, not even of a level of a 39(1) and 2, but of a higher threshold, as was stated in one of the judgments by the Supreme Court, of a level of the case of ITEC Corporation. So let me just take you through the way the law on unconditional bank guarantees has developed over the years. Now, it was way back in 1969 when the Supreme Court in Tarapor's case had observed that an irrevocable letter of credit had a definite implication. It was independent of and unqualified by the contract of sale or other underlying transactions, It was independent of and unqualified by anything between the parties as their inter se disputes, etc. It was a mechanism of great importance in international trade, and any interference with that mechanism was bound to have serious repercussions on international trade of this country. In this situation, the court had declined to grant any injunction against the invocation. So the tone and the tenor of the judgment really started the trend of non-interference by the court in matters of unconditional bank guarantees. In the UP State Sugar Corporation case, the question again arose in 1997. And this is what the Supreme Court had to say, which has been followed throughout. The law relating to invocation of bank guarantees is settled. When in the course of commercial dealings, an unconditional bank guarantee is given or accepted, the beneficiary is entitled to realize such a bank guarantee in terms thereof, irrespective of any pending disputes. The bank giving such a guarantee is bound to honor it as per its terms, irrespective of any other dispute between the parties. The court then carved out exceptions. The exception was a fraud in connection with such a bank guarantee, which would vitiate the entire transaction. Hence, the court said, if there is such a fraud of which the beneficiary seeks to take advantage, he can be restrained from doing so. The second exception, the court said, relates to cases where allowing the encashment of an unconditional bank guarantee would result in an irretrievable harm or injustice to one of the parties concerned. Since in most cases payment of money under such a bank guarantee would adversely affect the bank and its customers at whose instance the guarantee is given, the harm or injury contemplated under this head must be of such an exceptional and irretrievable nature as would override the terms of the guarantee and the adverse effect of such an injunction on commercial dealings in the country. So this is how the trend started and exceptions were carved out. In the UP Cooperation Federation case in 1988, there were two bank guarantees which were sought to be invoked back to back. The appellant alleged that the respondent was in breach of the terms of the contract and sought to invoke both the bank guarantees. The respondent invoked the jurisdiction of the civil judge to seek a stay, which was dismissed, and then he appealed before the High Court. The High Court granted an injunction against the invocation of the bank guarantee and actually held that all these pleas that the bank guarantee is a separate contract, it is unaffected by the disputes, etc., are only technical. This judgment was then carried to the Supreme Court. And this is what the Supreme Court had to say. Under the terms agreed to between the parties, there is no scope of injunction. The High Court proceeded on the basis that this was not an injunction sought against the bank, but against the appellant. Now, this case is also significant, if I may, I just pause in between, because very often they're not. The pleas are raised that after all, we are only seeking an injunction against the party which is in breach, that is the first respondent herein. It's not against the bank. We are not saying anything against the bank. Our relief is not against the bank. So it is in this background that the Supreme Court further observed, the net effect of the injunction is to restrain the bank from performing the bank guarantee. That cannot be done. One cannot do indirectly what one is not free to do directly. The respondent was not to suffer any injustice, which was irretrievable, and can certainly at a later stage sue for damages. So the Supreme Court was very clear that none of these pleas are going to work, and even indirectly you cannot seek an injunction against the bank. The court further held the commitments of the bank must be honored, free from interference by the courts. Otherwise, trust in commerce, internal and international, would be irreparably damaged. It is only in exceptional circumstances, in case of fraud or irretrievable injustice, that the courts can interfere. In one of the judgments authored by Justice Nandrajog in NHI's case, very beautifully in 2008, it was summed up. And I would like to read a portion of that judgment. Where the guarantee is unconditional or the bank has agreed to make payment without demur or protest, on the beneficiary invoking the bank guarantee, the bank is obliged to honor the same for the reason, like letters of credit, a bank guarantee, if not honored, would cause irreparable damage to the trust in commerce and would deprive vital oxygen to the money supply and money flow in commerce and transaction, which is necessary for the economic growth. Subsequently, in fact, in the case of Dwarike Sugar Industries, if I may say, the Supreme Court, in fact, deprecated the judgment of a High Court, where the High Court had actually gone on and stayed the invocation and encashment of a bank guarantee. The plea seeking injunction was a case where was that there will be an unjust enrichment. So the Supreme Court said these principles of unjust enrichment are far too weak when we talk about unconditional bank guarantees. And I would just like to read 3-4 lines out of this judgment. And I quote here, "It is unfortunate that the High Court did not consider it necessary to refer to various judicial pronouncements of this court in which the principles which have to be followed while examining an application for grant of interim relief on bank guarantees have been laid out. We do not find any justification for the High Court," is what the Supreme Court said, "to have granted the injunction. If the High Court had taken the trouble to see the law on the point, it would have been clear that in encashment of bank guarantee, applicability of principles of undue enrichment has no application." In the UP State Sugar case, in fact, the plea taken was that the company was a sick industrial company and proceedings were pending in BIFER. Even in a situation of that kind, the Supreme Court refused to interfere and said that there is no question, it's an unconditional bank guarantee, it will have to be honored. And the Supreme Court said the bank is bound to honor it as per terms of the bank guarantee, and it relied on the earlier judgment, which I just referred to a little earlier, in UP Cooperative Federation, where the court had held that the bank is not concerned in the least with the relations between the supplier and the customer, and nor with the question whether the supplier has performed his contractual obligations or is in default thereof. The bank must pay according to the tenor of its guarantee on demand. And this case is also significant because it's here that the court had said that a mere irretrievable harm or injury would not be enough to restrain the invocation, and the threshold should be as high as the kind envisaged in the case of ITEC Corporation. Now, ITEC Corporation is the threshold which has been laid down even for an irretrievable injury. So ITEC was a very extreme example case where an exporter from the US had entered into a contract with the imperial government of Iran. Problems occurred. The US had cancelled the export. There were hostages situations, etc., and the US had blocked all the Iranian assets. It is in this situation that the court said that this is an irretrievable harm, and this is the threshold of irretrievable harm. As far as the two exceptions are concerned, other than irretrievable injury, the second one is fraud. Now, the exception of fraud to the rule of this absolute independence of the letter of credit was for the first time applied in an American case of Henry Skoda Bank Corporation. And this was a case where the plaintiff had wanted to buy a particular item, and when the consignments came, there was nothing there. Everything was a junk or a trash. And it is here that the court said there's a total fraudulent invocation, and the court had for the first time applied the exception of fraud to unconditional bank guarantees. Recently, also, the High Court in 2018, in the case of classic KSM Bashir, has again laid down certain principles which have to be followed, and held that the fraud has to be established fraud. It cannot be a mere vague allegation that one can base a case under Section 9 on. In the Himadri chemical case, the Supreme Court in 2007 has actually laid down certain principles which are followed till date. So when the courts are exercising their powers under Section 9, even today, these principles, 6 of these principles have been laid down, which have been subsequently re-emphasized in Gujarat Maritime. And I'll just quickly, in about 2 minutes, take everybody through these in short. So the first principle is, while dealing with an application for injunction in the course of commercial dealings, when an unconditional bank guarantee is given and accepted, the beneficiary is entitled to realize the bank guarantee or a letter of credit, irrespective of any pending dispute relating to the terms of the contract. The bank giving such guarantee is bound to honor it as per its terms. The courts should be slow in granting an order of injunction to restrain the realization of bank guarantee or a letter of credit. The bank guarantee is an independent and a separate contract, is absolute in nature. The existence of any dispute is completely alien. Fraud of an egregious nature, now that's important, which would vitiate the very foundation of such a bank guarantee, and the beneficiary seeks to take advantage of the situation, is where the courts may consider interfering. And the other one, of course, is the irretrievable harm. In a very recent case, in fact, in 2019 in UMEX, one of the benches of our Delhi High Court had refused to grant injunction, though it was a case where a huge financial crisis was being set up by the petitioner. But the court said monetary consideration, financial crisis, the insolvency, all of these is something which will not come in the way of the invocation and encashment of an unconditional bank guarantee. Of course, to sum up on this topic, I wouldn't end by saying that there have been no cases where unconditional bank guarantees have never been restrained from invocation. So special equities are, there are cases where they have been. In fact, a very recent example, if I may say, of where the special equity doctrine has been invoked is during this pandemic situation in the case of Halliburton. The Delhi High Court has restrained the bank guarantee, exercising the doctrine of special equities. There could be other cases. One of them is Gangotri, which is a very famous and well-known case, which is often cited by the petitioners, where again the court had restrained, but that was one of those cases where the bank guarantee sought to be invoked did not even relate to the contract in question, and it was a fraudulent invocation, etc. So to sum up, the law on bank guarantees, as I look at it, is that when it's unconditional, irrevocable bank guarantee, the rule or the norm is no injunction. Exceptions being 2, which I've just referred to. Very quickly, in 5 minutes, since the time is running out in the slot that's been allotted to me. So as far as the second topic is concerned, I'll just quickly sum up on that as well. So when the court is exercising its power under Section 9, the debate has been whether the principles of CPC, Order 38, Order 39, Rule 1 and 2 would apply or not. Now this, if I would say, is no longer res integra at all. So starting from, there are 3 judgments which I, at least speaking for myself, can say have very beautifully summed up this law. One of them is Adhunik Steel's 2007, which was that mining case, and followed by a division bench of the Bombay High Court in Nimbus, and recently the Delhi High Court in the case of BMW. So the crux of the entire judgments is this, that, well, very strictly, textually, or with a lot of vigor, one would not say that CPC provisions would apply, but the guiding principles will always apply. It cannot be said that when you're exercising power under Section 9, you'll have to keep those principles aside. So when we are deciding a Section 9 petition as a court, one is required to keep in mind 39, 1 and 2, which means that prima facie case, balance of convenience, and irreparable harm and injury. Insofar as Order 38, Rule 5 is concerned, the courts have said 2 principles have been laid down in Raman Tech case, which is that first, before laying down the principles, the first thing that I must say that when it comes to the principles of Order 38, Rule 5, the courts have said these are very extreme and drastic powers, because this is attachment before judgment. So the courts have been always told to exercise them very carefully in very exceptional circumstances. And twin principles that have been laid down in several judgments over the years is a prima facie case being set up by the party. And secondly, and equally important, is that the court will have to be convinced by the party through some prima facie evidence on record that the other party is in the process of dissipating, disposing away its assets, taking them out of the jurisdiction of the court, so much so that tomorrow, if the party approaching the court was to succeed in arbitration, the award will be a mere paper award. So these are the two twin principles which have been laid down as far as powers being exercised under 9 are concerned. Before I end, I would just read out one paragraph from Adhunik, and I think this would just sum up. This is what the Supreme Court said. It is true that Section 9 of the Act speaks of the court by way of an interim measure, passing an order for protection, preservation, interim custody or sale, which are subject matter of the arbitration agreement, and such interim measure of protection as may appear to be just and convenient. The grant of an interim prohibitory injunction or an interim mandatory injunction are governed by well-known rules, and it is difficult to imagine that the legislature, while enacting Section 9, intended to make a provision which was dehorse the accepted principle that governed the grant of interim injunction. And finally, towards the end, it concluded, it is not possible to keep out the concept of balance of convenience, prima facie case, irreparable injury, and the concept of just and convenience while passing interim orders under Section 9 of the Act. So with this, I would thank everybody and pass the baton on to Mr. Tripathi.
Justice Jyoti Singh and friends. Arbitration and the formal court system has not always had a very hunky-dory relationship. In fact, the belief was that the dispute resolution system envisaged in arbitration was a child of a lesser god, if I could paraphrase an expression. And therefore, not surprisingly, as late as in 1912, in Dolman's case, which is a King's Bench decision, the finding was that we will apply common law, which means that if parties have entered into an arbitration agreement, either of them can resile from it and you have no remedy. The only exception was if that agreement has been made by the will of the court. And in such a case, you could also resile from arbitration because arbitration wasn't really that good a thing. But you had to get the leave of court to resile from arbitration. This is how it was in 1910, 20, 30. And then, of course, things changed. And we are now, of course, in 2020, which is a totally different ballgame. The two important amendments and the two important provisions relevant really for today's discussion is Section 2.2 and Section 9 as amended. Section 2.2 because it settles that whole confusion which was there as to how much of Part 1 would apply to international arbitration, and that is Bhatia International, Balco, etc. That got settled with finally with the amendment to 2.2, which said that even in international arbitrations, Section 9, Section 27, which is taking evidence and assistance of the court, and 37(1)(b), wrongly written as 37(1)(a) in the 2015 amendment, but corrected later, and 37(3), which are the appellate provisions from a Section 9 order. Therefore, the interference or really, as Mustil says, protection by the court, using the powerful system of the court to protect and preserve arbitration, was made available in India even to international commercial arbitration with great legislative clarity. Section 9, on the other hand, again underwent amendment. The basic amendment was in 2015. 9.2 was introduced. In Sundaram Finance, Supreme Court had said that when you come rushing to 9, you must display a manifest intention that you do intend to arbitrate. You've not just come for a Section 9, you pocket your Section 9 and then like an FDR sit and enjoy the interest. That's not all. Now that manifest intention was given a quantitative figure, that is within 90 days you must now under section 9.2 approach the arbitral proceedings or arbitral tribunal. And 9.3 follows the principle because section 9 says that court can interfere before, during, and after the arbitral proceedings are over. Therefore, and under section 32, the normal way in which an arbitration proceeding terminates is with the pronouncement of the award. Therefore, section 9 subsection 3 said that as a general rule, a court will not interfere if the AT or the arbitral tribunal is in place unless the court is satisfied that the relief under 17, there are circumstances which exist that 17 will not remain an efficacious remedy for whatever reason. That's a big burden to discharge. Now, Justice Singh rightly used the expression baton when she ended her very learned discourse. Now, Lord must still use that expression in a different way. So what he said was that really in arbitration, what happens is that you have initially a baton which is with the court, because at that point in time, there is no tribunal. Leave aside the emergency award provisions for a moment, because that's a later development. So you have the baton which is clearly in the grasp of the court. Court has to that extent the first existence advantage, because court is always there. Tribunal has to come into existence. Then comes stage 2 where the baton passes on from the court to the tribunal. That is when the tribunal is in season of the arbitration proceeding. And then the proceedings terminate under 32 of the 96 Act. And then the baton is handed back to the court so that the court can lend its coercive power to execute the award, or of course to set it aside as the case may be. The way section 9 and interim measures are looked upon have been dealt with in a 1993 House of Lords. And see the difference from Dolman 1912, which says arbitration agreement may be enforced if you feel like it, which is of course saying nothing. To 1993 House of Lords, it says that the interim measure is not to encroach in the field of arbitration, but to reinforce arbitration, to make arbitration more effective, and is a powerful weapon in furtherance of arbitration. So that is how the scheme is. Needless to say that the amendments which were made after there were detailed Law Commission reports, that is the 176 and 246 reports. So that is really, in a nutshell, the statutory lay of the land as far as interim measures of protection are concerned. A large part of it has already been covered by Justice Jyoti Singh. I'll just put in a few pillars here and there to complete, in a sense, the narration. One interesting, there are 2 or 3 very interesting and teasing issues which arise in this area. One is this concept of emergency arbitration. I can't say it's a new concept, but it is it's a concept of comparatively recent origin. So now in the baton between court and the arbitral tribunal, you will have a new entrant, which is the emergency arbitral tribunal. So sometimes, rather often, constituting an arbitral tribunal takes time. So you can approach the institution, whether it is ICC, SEAC, etc., to have an emergency arbitral tribunal. So now the baton will be shared with 3 people. The Princess Diana had once very famously remarked that in a marriage, 3 is a crowd. But as far as batons are concerned, in arbitration and court, the system of 3 works. So the way it works is, for instance, you have in ICC, you have a provision, of course, of the tribunal, that is the properly constituted AT, which is the regular tribunal. We call it the regular tribunal as opposed to the emergency tribunal. Then there's a provision which says that you can always approach the competent judicial authority as well, till such time the tribunal is in place. You also now have an option of invoking the emergency tribunal, which will give, they call it an emergency award, which is actually an emergency interim order, which will then, and this tribunal is not comprising of the same members which your regular tribunal would. And then it will go to the regular tribunal. The regular tribunal can deal with it in its power akin to Section 17 of our Act and decide what it wants to do about it. So this is the scheme of emergency arbitration, which is greater recourse is being taken there, and is now really, in a sense, arbitration wants to become really a completely self-contained justice delivery system, or a self-contained dispute resolution system, with limiting the court interface with the court only at the stage, if possible, of Section 34 or its equivalent, that is execution, and nothing less. Now, this issue came up for the first time in the judgment of Raffles 2016, where in SEAC arbitration, a party was successful and obtained an interim order in its favor in the emergency arbitration. Now the question is, how do you enforce it? Because it's not self-enforcing. So it came to India and moved to Section 9 in the Delhi High Court and said that please enforce it. The Delhi High Court said, rightly, that I can't enforce it because enforcement is not contemplated, unlike 47, 48, 49, etc. of an award. It's not contemplated of a Section 9 in the scheme. However, you can try and convince me that I should pass the same order independently. It's very important in Section 9. And the party argued it and was able to persuade the court, and the court therefore passed an independent order. Now here is a place where a little bit of legislative clarity would help, because rightly the court says I can't enforce it, but you argue it afresh. The second time it came up was in the case of Ashwini Minda, which is 2020. This is a very recent, as they say, hot from the oven case. Now, in Minda's case, the facts were a little different. The party had gone, this was under the JCAA, which is the Japanese Commercial Arbitration, Institutional Arbitration, and they had gone, they had a bite at the cherry and they lost. So they came to the Delhi High Court and said, please give me this relief and please set aside the interim order with which I'm dissatisfied. Now, the court held, and rightly so, it distinguished the JCAA scheme with the SEAC scheme and came to a conclusion that there is an implied shutout in approaching the court, because in SEAC and ICC, there are specific provisions which contemplate you can approach the competent judicial authority, which JCAA does not have. And secondly, it reiterated that SEAC expressly permitted such an approach, that is, you can approach the court, and therefore distinguished it from Raffles, and therefore did not interfere and rejected the Section 9 petition. One more argument which was very ably made by the respondent and which found favor with the court was that you are really having a second bite at the cherry. You had the first bite in EA. It was up to you. You had the option, because as I said, 3 is a crowd even here. You could have said that I won't invoke EA. I will come in Section 9. That was open to you. But you invoked EA. You got rebuffed in EA. Now you come here again. But one interesting thought which strikes me is an interesting argument which unfortunately was not raised before the court, is that if in Raffles, the court will neither enforce nor deal with the merits of the emergency interim award, but apply its mind independently. Therefore, could the petitioner have said that please ignore the fact that I'm having a second bite at the cherry. This is the only bite at the cherry, because please examine independently whether I'm entitled to this relief. Had that argument been raised, I don't know where it would have gone. But that argument was not raised. What was only argued was, please correct, this is a wrong order, please correct it, and I'm entitled to come here. And frankly, no answer was given as to what is the distinction between JCAA, that is the Japanese system, and SEAC. That no attempt was made really by the petitioner to distinguish it, if at all there could be a distinction. But this is a very, very interesting and evolving area, That is, the question which arises is this, that the EA, the interim award by an emergency arbitral tribunal, is either for or against, whatever it is. Now, is it open to a party which is dissatisfied by that award to come to an Indian court under Section 9 and say, please keep aside the interim award passed by the emergency arbitral tribunal because you are not an executing court, that burden can't be put on to you. Please examine the issue independently afresh. Now, look at the problems this will create if we take it to its logical conclusion. This would really mean that the first round before the emergency tribunal becomes really a mock exercise. So you finalize and you improve your arguments and find out what the defenses are, and then come and do the real exercise in Section 9. Because if Section 9 is to be an independent examination, then of course that it could result in that as well. So that's an area where I think legislative clarity is required as to what is, and an answer can be akin to what is found in 9.3, that as a normal rule, an Indian court will not interfere once an interim direction is issued by an emergency tribunal, and will consider passing such orders as to make the arbitration process efficacious. But that has to come by statute. That can't come by a judge-made law, because that will be writing the law. So I think there is scope for a 2020 amendment as well after 2015 and 2019. Then comes the second interesting issue, that is, what are the parameters of recourse to Section 9? I think Justice Singh has very ably dealt with it. I can add nothing to that at all. The only thing is, of course, that you follow the trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh of injunction, that is prima facie case, balance of convenience, and grave and irreparable loss, which has already been pointed out, and that is how it is. And Adhunik Steel and the two other judgments which have been mentioned really cover the field totally. One last aspect of interest, which is again a evolving issue, is an issue of how much of CPC would apply in the context of, can a court in Section 9 give a interim monetary relief? Now that's a live issue in division bench in Delhi and in some other courts. But the question is very interesting. It arises in the context of Order 39, Rule 10. Now there was an earlier view taken in Ratnagiri Gas and Power, which said that, look, you can't go as far as directing interim payment. But in Ratnagiri, apparently, 3910 was not placed in its true perspective before the division bench. And the division bench said, no, you can't, because there's a powerful argument there. The powerful argument being that that becomes final adjudicatory function, which is the province of the tribunal and not of the court in Section 9. But this was revisited in Value Source Mercantile a year later, where a division bench said that 3910 was not brought in its true perspective before the court. And therefore, it said in an appropriate case, an interim payment can be made in view of the principle underlying 3910, Order 39, Rule 10 of the CPC, where in an appropriate case, such an order may be passed. It remains an interim order. It can be modified, etc. So that's an area which is of interest and of evolution as to how it works out. Lastly, I was told to talk a little about third-party participation or injunctions with third parties. That has again been completely, as they say, the field is covered by the discourse of Justice Jyoti Singh, because she has already dealt with it. It's largely in the context of bank guarantee, and that aspect has been totally covered. So thank you very much. And it's a very interesting experience to address people in a gathering. I have the benefit of seeing the distinguished speaker and on and off the moderators, but that's about all which I can see. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir and ma'am, for a wonderful discourse on arbitration and Section 9. Justice Singh explained to us the fundamentals of bank guarantees, particularly irrevocable and unconditional bank guarantees, and when courts are likely to injunct the same, invocation of the same. She also explained to us the applicability of CPC principles as guiding principles in arbitration cases before courts. Sir explained to us how the baton passes from courts to tribunals and to courts and now to emergency arbitral tribunals as well. It's beautifully explained the Raffles judgment as well as the Menda judgment, and we'll have to wait to see if he gets to argue that his client wasn't actually looking at a second bite at the cherry, but would like the court to independently examine his case, or maybe we'll have another amendment as suggested by him. We'll now start with some questions. So my first question would be to Justice Singh. Post the amendment and Section 17 no longer being a remedy without any actual force in it, how likely do you think are courts to interfere in a section under Section 9(3)? So in cases of pending arbitrations, are courts likely to interfere?
Akanksha, in my personal view, in very rare circumstances. In fact, the section itself contemplates a situation where the tribunal is in place and almost, I wouldn't say that it ousts the jurisdiction of Section 9, it cannot. But the intervention and the past judgments that I've seen have been very, very rare. Perhaps in cases, at least the ones that I have come across, are where the arbitral tribunal was in place, but one of the members recused out of the panel, or for a long time the arbitration hearings were not being fixed or something of the sort. There's only one other judgment that I recollect by a division bench of our court, I think by Justice Badr Ahmed, if I'm not mistaken, where was one of the cases where the High Court had initially granted a stay order. It related to some distribution agreement or something. The facts being what they were, the court said that now we've granted that order, we do not want to vacate it and let it continue, and the arbitral tribunal will then finally decide the matter with the order continuing. So this is one of those rare matters, but most likely, in my personal view, interference will be far too less.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks to both the speakers, an extremely insightful discussion of the topic, both Justice Singh and Mr. Tripathi. Parag sir, if I may address this question to you, with regard to the 2015 amendment having expanded the applicability of Section 9 to foreign-seated arbitrations, can a party move the Indian courts under Section 9 acquire an arbitration at a foreign seat whose awards are not recognized under the Indian law? They could be non-reciprocal countries or non-convention countries for that matter, but those awards are not recognized in the Indian law.
Yeah, I think correct me, Shashwat, if I'm wrong, but there'll be very few such countries, but there would be some countries. So you can't say there won't be any such countries which fall outside that pale. As far as the statutory scheme is concerned, there doesn't seem to be any express bar to it, because it is also foreign international commercial arbitration. The question is that once such a point is tested, I haven't come across any judgment on it, but I'm sure there may be. I frankly haven't come across. It is possible that a court may take a view that if the final award itself cannot be enforced in India, where is the question of giving an interim award, because interim order, because an interim order is a step in aid of the process. If the main process is not possible, as far as India is concerned, doesn't recognize it, then what's the question of having a step in aid? The same reason where if, on the same analogy, if you can't give the final relief, you can't give an interim relief. The other view can be that, look, the scheme of the Arbitration Act is that we must encourage arbitration as an alternative dispute resolution mechanism. What you do with your award is your problem. But surely we are trying to make it efficacious, and there is no harm in our interfering under Section 9. So I hope I have kept my answer deliciously ambivalent.
Sir.
Thank you, sir.
And therefore,
Ma'am, my
therefore,
next question.
from either side.
My next question, ma'am, this would apply in the case of a tribunal acting under Section 17 or even an emergency arbitrator. Would a party be then able to raise the plea of res judicata, say if an emergency arbitrator or an arbitrator acting under Section 17 were to reject the relief, and then the court comes back, then the party comes to court after that under Section 9?
Are you saying that the party goes under Section 17 and then comes to the court, or are you saying reverse?
No, if they go under Section 17, say the arbitrator was to reject their relief and then come to court under Section 9.
So
Under
if
9.
the party, see, there are two ways, two situations can arise here. If the party goes under Section 17 first to the tribunal for an interim relief and it is rejected, then the remedy is not Section 9, then the remedy is an appeal under Section 37.
Yes.
So that will be the remedy clearly, and you're entitled to do that. And the court then, because it's an appeal, the court does look into it. Of course, there are parameters which have been laid down by the court because it's the threshold stage, it's a prima facie interim order stage. So how much the court would interfere on the facts, the parameters have been laid down by a number of High Court judgments now as to how much would you interfere. But if the situation is reversed, where the party is first come under 9, of course, then there's no question of res judicata at all, because these are again those prima facie threshold stages. That's an interim arrangement that the court makes. The court doesn't have the benefit of any evidence at that stage or anything and passes an order. And the cue to this is very often you would have seen when Section 9s are disposed of with 11 or separately, the court often says that you're entitled to now go before the arbitral tribunal, and under Section 17, it's open to the tribunal to vary the order or vacate the order at the instance of the other party or something. So there is no final decision on merits between the parties. So res judicata in the second case wouldn't apply at all. In the first one, of course, it's an appeal, so there's no question of res judicata. I hope I've answered that.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes.
Sir, just to Parag sir. Sir, you spoke at length on the interplay between the emergency arbitrator provisions and Section 9. Now, in reference to an international commercial arbitration administered under an institution, what will be the impact of a parallel proceeding where one party has invoked the emergency arbitration and the other party then chooses to file a Section 9?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there can be more than one way of looking at it, but I guess the view which might find favor with a court is that surely the scheme of the Arbitration Act is not that it's a parallel relay race, that the court is also carrying on and considering the same issue, and the tribunal is also considering the same issue. My guess is that pragmatism will prevail, and the court will say that maybe supposing one of the parties invoke the EA first, they'll say, let the EA come and conclude. Because what is the point are going parallelly along with the EA? Because one of the purposes of the Arbitration Act is also to relieve the courts of an excessive docket explosion. So if the court will be compelled to do a section here, go through a Section 9, because Section 9 takes time by the time a serious Section 9 is argued. And the EA is also argued. So the court may say, sorry, let the EA come to its conclusion, and then depending on the two judgments referred to, which I mentioned earlier, that is Raffles and Minda, the court will say that let the EA come to its conclusion and I'll then deal with it. I think that would probably, because as lawyers, we can only second guess what the final view would be. But that seems to be the view which is likely to get the acceptance of the court.
So, fair enough, fair enough. So my next question, if I may address to Justice Singh, can both parties apply for interim relief under Section 9 after the award has been passed but before its enforcement, or only that party in whose favor the award has been passed in order to, let's say, protect the subject matter of the award, ma'am?
So Shashwat, if you look at it logically, the answer would be the successful party. Surely the unsuccessful party cannot approach under Section 9 post the award. And I think the reason is not far to seek. And there is also a division bench of our High Court, Delhi High Court, which has already interpreted this, if I'm not mistaken, by Justice Nadrajog and Justice Mukta Gupta's division bench, has already looked into this aspect. And the logic is simple. When the party has an award in its favor, it is this party which moves towards enforcement of the award, right? As far as the other party is concerned, has an option. It goes to the High Court under 34, I mean, depending on the pecuniary jurisdiction, under 34, and files an objection. Assuming that it was to succeed in its objections and is able to have the award set aside to the extent of the rejection of its claim, even then it's not a decree. It doesn't become a decree at all. So if you look at the first two stages of Section 9, pre and during, these are actually in aid of the arbitration. But if you look at the third stage of Section 9, it's actually in aid of enforcement. So surely a party which is moving towards enforcement in this integument period of the award and its enforcement, because enforcement under 36 will be at a much later stage, where either the application under 34 by the other side is not being made, but you'll have to wait for that time to go by the statutory period, or it's been made and rejected, but which again will be, in some time. So it's then when the award becomes enforceable. So it's this integument stage where the Section 9 will come into play, because there could be property, there could be other assets which could be likely to be dissipated by the unsuccessful party. So to secure, preserve all of that, so that you're able to reap the fruits of the award, Section 9 will come to the aid and rescue of the successful party. At least speaking for myself, I don't see any reason how an unsuccessful party will be entitled to approach the court under 9.
Right. Fair enough.
Thank you, ma'am. My next question is to you, sir. So do you think there should be a difference in approach under Section 9, or there's likely to be a difference in approach under Section 9 when the case being dealt with is arising from a international commercial arbitration as opposed to a domestic arbitration, or even an institutional arbitration where the institution has an emergency arbitration provision and otherwise provisions will get in relief?
Yeah, that's an interesting question which has been asked. There are at least two levels to this question. One is, what would be the chances of the court accepting that a Section 9 is maintainable where there is a provision for emergency arbitration? I think in the scheme, and that I can only give my view on it, I think in the scheme as it stands today, it is really left to the option of the party, because either way, whether he goes for emergency arbitration for an ad interim order or he comes in Section 9 for an ad interim order, either way, he is only protecting the status quo, which requires protection till the tribunal starts or gets seasoned of the matter. So therefore, I think I can't say that it's not maintainable. I think it's maintainable. Then comes the second level of question: what is the nature of exercise of a Section 9 power? Will it change in the context of a domestic arbitration and an international arbitration? And that's a broader issue. And the answer again is at two levels. At one level, the same trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh is there: balance of convenience, prima facie case, irreparable loss. However, there is one major difference between national and domestic and international arbitration. That is of the substantive law which governs the rights of the parties. So therefore, though the tests will be the same, take a case of a covenant that I will not compete with you after I cease to be your employee. Now, such a covenant is not enforceable in India. It's against law. But in England, it is enforceable subject to reasonableness. So when you apply the Trinity test in an international commercial arbitration, you may come to a different view and you may or may not give an injunction. In India, you may say that, sorry, this injunction can't be given because it is against public policy. So the difference will come not because you are applying a different set of principles. Difference will come because you will be instructed in the foreign law, which is the substantive law. because that is instruction as of fact. A foreign law becomes a question of fact in a court, and then apply that law. But the principles would be the same. That's what appears to me to be the case. But this suffers from all the frailties of an opinion of counsel.
Thank you, sir.
So, thank you, sir. I'll again address this to Mr. Tripathi. If someone has contracted to have their arbitration administered through an institution, let's say SIAC, then can a party still take the benefit of Section 9 despite the emergency arbitrator provisions existing under the SIAC rules, sir?
Yeah, I think I sort of in a way. I think yes. I think under the present dispensation, it is left to the party to take that call, unless, as was found in Ashwini Minda's case, that there is something in the institutional rules which do not provide access to a competent judicial authority. In SIAC and ICC, the rule itself says you can approach the competent judicial authority. In Minda's case, the court found that the JCAA, the Japanese Commercial Arbitration Institutional Rule, do not provide for such an access. So there, of course, access is barred. But if the access is provided, then of course it's like in a specific performance suit. I can either ask for specific performance, or I can ask for damages in lieu of specific performance, or indeed I can ask for specific performance and a part damage as well. But certainly I can ask for specific performance or damages in lieu of specific performance. So my answer is that yes, as it stands today, it appears to me that it is left to the discretion of the party, and I think that should be a fair view.
Fair enough.
Thank you, sir. The next question is actually coming from the audience. One Mr. Shivang Singh asks, and it's addressed to both the panelists. His question is, at the end of the day, is it correct to state that the EA orders, even if not directly enforceable, remain an effective means of emergency relief?
Mr. Singh, would you like to?
Just party, you would have to answer this. There's certain that I wouldn't want to.
I understand, because there are various matters which are live, which I understand. See, as I understand, the question is, what is the status of an order under emergency arbitration, even if it is not enforceable? Broadly, Akanksha, isn't that the question?
Yes. Yes.
The answer is that it is the same way as if you get an award against a company which is bankrupt. So unless you are able to get it executed, the EA award is meaningless. Now, as per Indian law, you can't execute it if it's an international arbitration in India, but you can certainly go in Section 9 and persuade the court to independently come to the same conclusion, and then the enforcement and coercive power and prowess of the court will come to your aid to ensure that the EA order is not meaningless, if you are able to persuade the Indian court that that is the correct order to be passed. But on the other hand, if you fail in that endeavor, then in any case you lose it. So by itself, I think the EA order, as I said earlier, is like a mock trial. So if you win your moot court in a mock trial, and then you go for the actual finals and lose it there, you've lost it. But if you lose in the mock trial and win it there, you've won it. So the real trial is going to be, the real order will be what you get in Section 9. If you're able to persuade the court to accept that reasoning which found favor with the EA, then you can enforce it. Unless, of course, in the institutional rules, there's a provision for enforcement, or in the law of the seat of arbitration, there's a provision which says it can be enforced. Supposing there's such a provision, then of course you get a benefit there. But I'm talking from the viewpoint of Indian law.
Thank you, sir.
So I have a question, and that question is from the audience, but I will say it's from my friend Mr. Shashank Garg. It's open to the panel. In cases where Section 9 and Section 11 petitions are being heard together, and where the court, with the consent of the parties, is likely to refer the matter to DIAC for conduct of arbitration, will it not be prudent and practical to refer them for the emergency arbitration under the DIAC rules in reference to their Section 9 petition? My understanding is saying instead of the court deciding the Section 9 itself, should it not be left for DIAC, the Delhi International Arbitration Center, EA provisions to take that up?
Yeah, Shashwat, as both you and Shashank know, that in law, you never have a 100% answer. So as a normal rule, this looks very attractive. But there may be a case of a recalcitrant party whose conduct has so completely annoyed the court for good reason that the court feels that this is a dishonest party. If I give them this little chance to go and wait till, say, Mr. Bajpayee's client, Dr. Bajpayee's client is able to move his Section 17 before DIAC, they will take away all the property. So as a normal rule, yes, if it is a complicated issue where 2 weeks, 4 weeks delay will not make much of a difference, then I think the court will say, why should I? My hands are full as it is. I don't want to add work. But if the court gets a feeling that here is a party which is completely bent upon acting mala fide and will use this time gap of a week to do changes which will make the arbitration itself inefficacious, then I guess, but yes, as a normal rule, you're right. You're right.
Fair enough. I think we've run out of time, so I'll hand it over to Ajay. I must thank Parag sir and Jyoti ma'am, of course, my co-moderator, Akanksha. Thank you. Over to you, Ajay.
Thank you, Shashwat. Now, one of the privileges of being the organizer is that one gets to have the last word literally. So, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of my colleagues at the Faculty of Law at Manav Rachna University, I'd like to thank the distinguished speakers for today, Justice Jyoti Singh and Mr. Parag Tripathi, for bringing your great erudition to this webinar, and also for sharing your views, opinions, and insights into what is a very exciting part of the world of arbitration, that is interim reliefs. Many thanks also to my good friend Shashank Garg for conceptualizing this Back to Basics series of webinars. As a matter of fact, Shashank was to give the closing remarks today, but unfortunately he's not been able to make it because he's been caught in a storm in Faridabad and hence has lost connectivity with this webinar. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would be failing in my duties if I were not to thank the two moderators of today's webinar, Akanksha Kaul and Dr. Shashwat Bajpayee, for very beautifully moderating this session. And last but not the least, I'd like to thank all the attendees. Ladies and gentlemen, a webinar or a conference or a seminar is nothing without all of you attending these, attending these events. So without you, we could not have had this webinar. So I'm most grateful to all of you for having made it here, notwithstanding the storm which is just brewing outside our respective offices and homes. So on that note, I thank you once again for sparing your valuable Sunday afternoon with us, and we'll hope to see you at one of our future webinars. I hope you have a very pleasant evening and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Ajay.